My name is Claire, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my family. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And the truth arrived at my doorstep in the most unexpected way possible. I live alone in a small apartment on Maple Street. It's the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows everyone, where Mrs. Henderson next door still brings me cookies every Sunday, and where the biggest excitement is usually the weekly farmers market. I chose this place specifically because it was quiet, predictable, safe. After years of chaos in my 20s, I craved ordinary. Tuesday morning started like any other. My alarm went off at 6 a.m. sharp. I stumbled to the kitchen, started the coffee maker, and was about to jump in the shower when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in my carefully orchestrated morning routine. Crying. Soft, desperate crying that seemed to be coming from right outside my door. At first, I assumed it was Mrs. Henderson's television. She's been getting hard of hearing lately, and sometimes has it up too loud. But as I stood there in my pajamas, clutching my coffee mug, the sound continued. It wasn't coming from next door. It was coming from my doorstep. I approached the door slowly, my heart starting to race for reasons I couldn't explain. Through the peephole, I could see nothing unusual, just the empty hallway, the same beige carpet, the same fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly yellow. But the crying continued. When I opened that door, my entire world tilted off its axis. There, lying on my doormat in a pale blue blanket, was a baby. A real, living, breathing baby. His little fists were clenched, his face red from crying, and his eyes, when they met mine, were the deepest brown I'd ever seen. Eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so small. My first instinct was to look around frantically. Someone had to be nearby. This had to be a mistake. Maybe a neighbor had set him down for just a moment while they fumbled for their keys. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate, twisted prank. But the hallway was empty. Dead empty. And then I noticed the note. It was pinned carefully to the blanket with a small safety pin. White paper, neat handwriting. Just one line that made my blood run cold. You said no one in your family ever told you the truth. I stared at those words until they blurred together. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. This wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had specifically chosen my door, my doorstep, my life to disrupt with this incredible responsibility. The baby, who I would later learn was named Noah, looked up at me with those impossibly wise eyes. In that moment, something shifted inside my chest, a feeling I couldn't name, couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. Like a lock clicking open in a room I didn't even know existed. I brought him inside because what else could I do? Leave him there? The thought never even crossed my mind. I cleared off my coffee table and made a makeshift bed with couch cushions and blankets. He stopped crying the moment we were inside, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this to happen. I called 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher was kind but efficient, asking questions I didn't have answers to. No, I didn't know where he came from. No, I didn't recognize the handwriting. No, I hadn't seen anyone suspicious in the area. Yes, I would wait for the officers to arrive. Officer Martinez and Officer Chen showed up within 15 minutes. They were professional, thorough, and completely baffled. They photographed everything. The note, the blanket, the doorstep, even me holding Noah. They asked if I had any enemies, any family disputes, any reason someone might target me specifically. I told them the truth. I lived a quiet life. I worked from home doing freelance graphic design. I had a small circle of friends, a distant relationship with my parents, and no romantic drama to speak of. I was, by all accounts, unremarkable. They took the note as evidence, filed their report, and called social services. But here's the thing that still gives me chills thinking about it. Social services was backed up. Emergency placements were full. The earliest they could take Noah was the following Monday. That gave me 5 days alone with a baby I'd never seen before, who had somehow been left specifically for me. The first night was the longest of my life. I'd never been around babies. I had no siblings, no nieces or nephews, no friends with children. Google became my best friend as I frantically searched how to change diapers, how to prepare formula, how to tell if a baby was sick or just fussy. But Noah wasn't fussy. That's what unnerved me the most. He was calm, almost eerily so. He would lie there looking around my apartment like he was taking inventory, like he was making himself at home. When I fed him, he watched my face intently. When I changed him, he never cried. It was like he was studying me, waiting for something. I barely slept that first night. Every few minutes I found myself checking to make sure he was still breathing. I'd read about SIDS, about all the terrible things that could happen to babies, and the weight of responsibility was crushing. This tiny human being was completely dependent on me, a woman who could barely keep houseplants alive. Wednesday morning brought the second note, and with it, the beginning of the truth that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. I was preparing Noah's morning bottle when I noticed the diaper bag. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. The police had photographed my entire doorway, and there had been no bag. But there it was, sitting neatly beside my door like it had always belonged there. Inside were diapers, formula, baby clothes in various sizes, and an envelope. My name was written on the outside in the same neat handwriting as the first note. But this message was longer, typed instead of handwritten, and it contained information that made me sink onto my couch in shock. His name is Noah. He is yours, not biologically, but by blood. Ask your father about May 12th, 2001. May 12th, 2001. The date was seared into my memory because it was the day my Aunt Sarah died. At least, that's what I'd always been told. She was my father's younger sister, and according to family lore, she'd died in a car accident when I was 16. I remembered the funeral being closed casket, remembered my mother crying for days afterward, remembered how my father wouldn't talk about it at all. But as I sat there holding this note, pieces of my memory started shifting, clicking into new configurations. I remembered how strange everyone had acted around Sarah's death, how conversations would stop when I entered the room, how my mother would get this haunted look whenever Sarah's name came up, how my father had boxed up all of Sarah's belongings within a week and refused to let anyone go through them. I'd chalked it all up to grief at the time. People process loss differently, and my family had never been particularly open about emotions. But now, with Noah sleeping peacefully in my arms and this note burning a hole in my thoughts, I began to wonder if there had been more to the story. My father and I weren't close. We never had been. He was a man of few words, preferring actions to emotions, work to family dinners. After my mother died 2 years ago, our already strained relationship had dwindled to obligatory holiday calls and birthday cards. The thought of confronting him about something this serious made my stomach churn. But I had to know. Noah deserved to know. And if someone was going through this much trouble to reveal family secrets, there had to be a reason. I drove to my father's house that afternoon with Noah strapped into a car seat I'd hastily purchased at Target. My father lived in the same house I'd grown up in. A modest 2-story colonial with a garden my mother had lovingly maintained, and that now looked sadly overgrown. He answered the door looking older than I remembered, his hair more gray, his shoulders more stooped. When he saw me standing there with a baby, his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like fear. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I couldn't. The words came out in a rush before I lost my nerve. What happened on May 12th, 2001? The coffee mug slipped from his hands like his fingers had forgotten how to work. It shattered on the hardwood floor of the entryway, sending ceramic shards skittering across the surface. But he didn't look down at the mess. He stared at me with the expression of a man who'd just seen a ghost walk through his front door. "Who told you that date?" he whispered, and his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "I found a baby," I said simply. "And someone left me a note." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. He looked at Noah, then back at me, then at Noah again. And then he said the words that confirmed my worst suspicions. "Oh God, it's happening again." He invited us inside, stepping carefully around the broken mug. His hands were shaking as he led us to the living room, the same room where I'd spent countless hours as a child, where family Christmas mornings had unfolded, where my mother had taught me to play piano on the old upright against the far wall. "Sit down," he said, and for the first time in my adult life, my father looked fragile. What I learned in the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about the aunt I'd barely remembered, and about the baby who had somehow found his way to my doorstep. Sarah hadn't died in a car accident. She hadn't died at all, at least not in 2001. She had disappeared, and my family had been keeping that secret for over 20 years. She'd been pregnant, my father told me, his voice barely above a whisper. And the father was someone who couldn't afford for that information to become public. Richard Blackwood. The name hit me like a physical blow. Richard Blackwood, the man who had served 3 terms as our state senator, who had run for governor twice, who was now one of the most powerful lobbyists in Washington. Richard Blackwood, who had been married to my mother before she met my father. Sarah had been barely 22 when she got involved with Richard. He was already married again by then, to a woman from a prominent political family. His career was just taking off, and a scandal involving an affair and an illegitimate child would have destroyed everything he'd worked for. When Sarah told him she was pregnant, he offered her money for an abortion. When she refused, he offered her more money to disappear. When she refused that too, threatening to go public with the whole story, he made her disappear anyway, not killed. My father was quick to clarify when he saw the horror on my face. But hidden, paid off, relocated, given a new identity and enough money to start over somewhere far away, with the understanding that she would never contact any of us again, never try to claim her child, never breathe a word about Richard Blackwood. But what about the baby? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. The baby was taken care of, my father said carefully. Richard had connections. Private adoption agencies that didn't ask too many questions. Wealthy families who wanted children and were willing to pay premium for discretion. I looked down at Noah, who was sleeping peacefully in my arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb. This beautiful, innocent child was the product of one of the ugliest stories I'd ever heard. But he was also family, my aunt's son. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked my father. "Why didn't you ever say anything before?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at my mother's neglected garden. "Because your mother made me promise never to tell you. She was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd try to find Sarah, and that would put you in danger. Richard Blackwood isn't the kind of man who forgives people who threaten his secrets." "But someone wants me to know now," I said. "Someone left Noah on my doorstep specifically because they want this story to come out." My father nodded grimly, which means either Sarah is dead and can't be hurt anymore, or someone has decided that enough time has passed and it's time for the truth to come out. That night, After I'd put Noah down for the night in the crib I'd assembled in my bedroom, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, diving deep into internet research about Richard Blackwood, about my Aunt Sarah, about private adoptions in 2001. What I found made my blood run cold. Richard Blackwood hadn't just been involved in one scandal. Over the years, there had been whispers about other women, other payoffs, other secrets. Nothing had ever stuck. Nothing had ever been proven. But the pattern was there for anyone who knew how to look. And Sarah wasn't the only young woman who had disappeared from our town around that time. 3 other women, all in their 20s, all with some connection to Richard Blackwood's social circle, had simply vanished between 1999 and 2003. Their families had been told they'd moved away for better opportunities. Their friends had been told they'd eloped, or joined the military, or decided to start fresh somewhere new. But none of them had ever been heard from again. I was beginning to understand why someone might have decided it was time for the truth to come out. And I was beginning to understand why Noah had been brought to me specifically. Because I looked like Sarah. The realization hit me as I was scrolling through old family photos on my laptop. There were only a few pictures of my aunt, but in every single one, the resemblance was striking. Same dark hair, same brown eyes, same heart-shaped face. We could have been sisters. Someone wanted Richard Blackwood to know that the past hadn't been buried as deeply as he thought. Someone wanted him to see Sarah's face looking back at him, holding the child he'd tried so hard to hide. The question was, who? And what did they want me to do about it? I got my answer the next morning in the form of the 3rd note. Thursday morning brought rain, and another envelope slipped under my door. This time I'd been expecting it. I'd barely slept, jumping at every sound, checking on Noah every few minutes, wondering who was watching us and when they'd make their next move. The envelope was thicker this time, containing several sheets of paper and something that made my hands shake the moment I saw it. Photographs. Old, slightly faded photographs of my Aunt Sarah that I'd never seen before. In the first photo, Sarah was visibly pregnant, maybe 7 or 8 months along, standing in front of a small house I didn't recognize. She looked young and scared, but there was something fierce in her eyes, something determined. The second photo showed her holding a baby, Noah, though he looked exactly the same as he did now, which seemed impossible. The third photo was the one that made me drop the entire stack. It was Sarah and me, side by side. Except it wasn't me. It was Sarah at my current age, but the resemblance was so striking it was like looking at a mirror image. We weren't just similar. We were nearly identical. The letter that accompanied the photos was longer than the others, and it was signed. For the first time, I knew who had been leaving me these messages. My name is Margaret Chen. I was a social worker in 2001, and I was the one who was supposed to process Noah's adoption. I was the one who was supposed to make sure he disappeared into the system forever. I was also the one who couldn't go through with it. I've been watching over Noah for 22 years, making sure he was safe, making sure he was loved. The family who adopted him were good people, but they died in a car accident 6 months ago. Noah has been in the foster system since then, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he aged out with nowhere to go. I'm dying, Claire. Cancer. I have maybe 2 months left, and I can't take this secret with me to the grave. Noah deserves to know where he comes from. He deserves to know he has family who might love him. And Richard Blackwood deserves to face the consequences of what he did. Your Aunt Sarah is alive. She's been living in Oregon under the name Rebecca Martinez. She's a nurse, never married, never had other children. She's been waiting 22 years for the day she could safely tell her story. That day is now. I'm giving you a choice, Claire. You can give Noah back to the system, pretend none of this ever happened, and go back to your quiet life. or you can be the one to finally bring the truth to light. You can be the one to give Noah the family he deserves and to make sure Richard Blackwood finally pays for what he's done. But I have to warn you, if you choose to move forward with this, your life will never be the same. Richard Blackwood is a powerful man with powerful friends. He's destroyed lives to protect his secrets, and he won't hesitate to try to destroy yours. The choice is yours. But know this, you're Noah's only chance at justice. You're Sarah's only chance at coming home. And you might be the only chance those other missing women have of their stories being told. If you decide to move forward, call the number at the bottom of this letter. If not, social services will pick up Noah on Monday as scheduled, and this will all be someone else's problem. I'm sorry to put this burden on you, Claire. But sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Sarah was alive. Noah was my cousin. And I was being asked to take on one of the most powerful men in the state to bring them both home. I looked at Noah, who was lying on his back on my couch, staring up at the ceiling with those 2 wise eyes. He deserved to know his mother. He deserved to know his story. And Sarah deserved to finally be free of the fear that had kept her hiding for more than 2 decades. But Margaret Chen was right. If I did this, my quiet, predictable life would be over forever. I called the number. Margaret Chen lived in a small apartment across town, and when I arrived with Noah, she looked exactly like what I'd expected from her letters. A small, frail woman with kind eyes and the unmistakable look of someone who didn't have long left. But her voice was strong, and her resolve was unshakable. She'd been carrying this secret for 22 years, she told me. She'd been a young social worker in 2001, fresh out of graduate school, and idealistic about making a difference in children's lives. When the Noah case came across her desk, something about it had felt wrong from the start. The adoption had been arranged through channels that were technically legal, but ethically questionable. Too much money, too many strings pulled, too many people who seemed more interested in making the baby disappear than in finding him a loving home. And when she'd started asking questions, she'd been quickly reassigned to other cases. But she'd kept copies of the files. She'd kept track of Noah's placement. And when she'd finally worked up the courage to investigate further, she'd uncovered the connection to Richard Blackwood and the truth about what had happened to Sarah. She'd been planning to go public with the information for years, but she'd been afraid. Richard Blackwood had the power to destroy her career, her life, her family. So she'd waited and watched and protected Noah from a distance. Now, with time running out, she was finally ready to act. She gave me a thick folder containing copies of all the documents she'd saved over the years. Adoption papers, medical records, financial transactions, and most importantly, a sworn affidavit from the doctor who had delivered Noah, confirming that Sarah had never consented to the adoption and had been coerced into giving up her child. She also gave me Sarah's contact information. "Your aunt has been waiting for this day for 22 years, Margaret told me. She's been living in constant fear that Richard Blackwood would find her, but she's also been hoping that someday, someone would come forward with the truth. She's ready to tell her story, but she needs to know that someone believes her, that someone will stand with her." I called Sarah that night after I'd put Noah to bed. The phone rang 4 times before a voice I didn't recognize answered. "Hello? Sarah? This is Claire. I'm your niece." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then I heard the sound of quiet crying. "I knew this day would come," she said finally. "I just didn't know when. Is Noah okay?" "He's perfect," I told her, "and he's here with me." We talked for 2 hours that night. Sarah told me about the last 22 years, about the fear she'd lived with every single day, about the jobs she'd taken using her fake identity, about the loneliness of being cut off from her family. She told me about the nightmares, about the constant looking over her shoulder, about the way she'd trained herself to never get too comfortable in any one place. But she also told me about the hope she'd carried all these years, the hope that someday she'd be reunited with her son, that someday the truth would come out, that someday Richard Blackwood would face consequences for what he'd done. She was ready to come forward, she told me. She was ready to tell her story publicly, to testify if necessary, to do whatever it took to make sure Noah knew the truth about where he came from. But she was also terrified. Richard Blackwood is not a man who forgives, she warned me. If we do this, if we go public, he'll come after all of us. He has the money and the connections to make our lives very difficult. Are you sure you're ready for that? I looked at Noah, who was sleeping peacefully in the crib I'd set up in my bedroom. This beautiful, innocent child who had done nothing wrong but had been paying the price for adult decisions his entire life. He deserved better. He deserved the truth. I'm ready, I told Sarah. But I'm not doing this alone. We're going to need help. The help came from an unexpected source. Jessica Rodriguez was an investigative journalist who had been tracking Richard Blackwood's activities for years. When I reached out to her through the tip line at her newspaper, she called me back within an hour. She'd been investigating the disappearances of young women connected to Richard Blackwood's social circle, she told me. She'd been looking for the smoking gun that would allow her to finally publish the story. Noah's case, combined with Sarah's testimony, might be exactly what she needed. But she warned me that going up against Richard Blackwood wouldn't be easy. He had a team of lawyers, a network of powerful friends, and a reputation for destroying anyone who tried to expose him. If we were going to do this, we needed to be smart, strategic, and absolutely certain of our facts. Over the next week, Jessica worked with Margaret Chen to verify all the documents and build an airtight case. Sarah flew in from Oregon, and I met my aunt for the first time in over 20 years. The resemblance between us was even more striking in person, but it was her eyes that really got to me. They were Noah's eyes, wise and knowing, and full of a pain that had been carried for far too long. The reunion between Sarah and Noah was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. The moment she held him, it was like a missing piece of the universe had clicked back into place. He looked at her with recognition, as if some part of him had always known she was his mother, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. But we all knew that the happy reunion was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. Jessica's article ran on a Sunday morning, and by Monday afternoon the story had gone viral. Richard Blackwood's office issued a statement denying all allegations and threatening to sue anyone who repeated the claims. His lawyers sent cease and desist letters to the newspaper, to Jessica, to me, and to Sarah. But the damage was done. Other women started coming forward with their own stories about Richard Blackwood. The families of the missing women from the early 2000s began demanding answers. Social media exploded with support for Sarah and Noah, and donations poured in to help with legal fees. The threats started almost immediately. Anonymous phone calls, emails, messages on social media. Nothing explicitly threatening, but the message was clear. Back off or face the consequences. I was scared. We all were. But we were also determined. Too many people had been hurt by Richard Blackwood's need to protect his secrets. Too many lives had been destroyed by his arrogance and his belief that he was above the law. The legal battle was long and exhausting. Richard Blackwood's lawyers fought every step of the way, challenging every piece of evidence, attacking Sarah's credibility, trying to paint the whole story as an elaborate hoax designed to extort money from their client. But the evidence was overwhelming. The adoption documents, the medical records, the financial transactions, the sworn statements from multiple witnesses. Most importantly, the DNA test that proved beyond any doubt that Noah was Sarah's son. The criminal charges were the first to be resolved. Richard Blackwood was arrested on charges of kidnapping, coercion, fraud, and conspiracy. The trial was a media circus, with reporters from around the country covering every detail of the case. Sarah's testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. She told her story with quiet dignity, describing the fear she'd lived with for 22 years, the pain of being separated from her son, the way Richard Blackwood had used his power and influence to silence her. When the jury returned their verdict after less than 6 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. But the civil case was where the real justice happened. The jury awarded Sarah and Noah damages in the millions, money that would ensure Noah's future and allow Sarah to finally live without fear. More importantly, the case set a precedent that would make it harder for powerful men to abuse their positions to silence victims. The other missing women were never found, but their cases were reopened, and several of Richard Blackwood's associates were arrested on related charges. The network of corruption and abuse that had protected him for decades finally began to crumble. Today, 2 years later, Sarah lives in a house just 10 minutes from my apartment. Noah, who is now 2 years old, splits his time between both of us, and I've never seen a child more loved or more secure. He's walking now, talking up a storm, and has his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubborn streak. Sarah is working as a nurse again, this time under her real name. She's in therapy, dealing with the trauma of the last 22 years, but she's also the happiest I've ever seen her. She's home, finally. Truly home. As for me, my quiet life is a thing of the past. I'm now the director of a foundation that helps women who've been victims of powerful men's abuse. I use my story, and Sarah's story, to show other victims that they don't have to stay silent, that they can fight back, that they can win. The foundation is housed in a building that was purchased with part of the settlement money from Richard Blackwood. There's a plaque by the front door that reads, "In memory of the women whose voices were silenced, and in honor of those who found the courage to speak." Every year on May 12th, Sarah and I light a candle for the women who never made it home. But we also celebrate the fact that Noah did make it home, that Sarah made it home, that sometimes, even when powerful people try to bury the truth, it finds a way to surface. The baby who was left on my doorstep changed everything. He brought my family back together. He brought justice to a man who thought he was untouchable. And he brought purpose to a life I thought was destined to be ordinary. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd chosen differently that first morning. If I'd called social services immediately. If I'd refused to get involved. If I'd let fear keep me from acting. Noah would have disappeared into the system. Sarah would still be hiding in Oregon, and Richard Blackwood would still be using his power to hurt people. But I didn't choose differently. I chose to fight, to tell the truth, to stand up for what was right even when it was terrifying. And because of that choice, a little boy got to meet his mother. A woman got to come home, and justice finally prevailed. The truth found a way, just like it always does. Sometimes it takes 22 years. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a baby on your doorstep. And sometimes it changes everything you thought you knew about your life. But it always, always finds a way.